Is that working? Might be working. All right. So the live stream is up. We're going to be talking about Sage vs. State chapters 7 and 8. Today, I am going to go over the sample ballot on Thursday. I'm still waiting on someone to get on our department to get back to me, but I know what I can and can't say. Right, I am going to do a pros cons. Right, I'm going to say here. I'm not going to do a pros cons. I'm going to say here are the things that will happen. Right, and then it'll be up to you to decide if those are pros and cons. I should be able to do that. I'm going to do the 5 questions. There are 6, but there are only 5 questions. Number 6 is a previous question. One of the things that I think is very useful that we're going to talk about is all of the questions are amendments to the Constitution. Right, we talked about this before. Right. So question 6, which is on the ballot, which passed 2 years ago, it's for more renewable energy, right? NVE has to be 50% renewable by 2030. And they're on track, right? That's not an issue, right? There isn't a lot of contest about that. But it amends the Constitution, right? Which means that later, if the courts have to decide something, they're going to say, no, this is an amendment to the Constitution. The courts shouldn't be involved in this. You change the Constitution specifically so the courts wouldn't be involved. What we're seeing is most of the amendments to the Constitution, most initiatives, most questions on the ballot are amendments because they skip the courts. That's problematic, right? That's the concern that we should be having, right? Why are we skipping this law aspect and making everything an amendment, right? Just as a comparison, right, there are 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. There are 5 proposed amendments to the Nevada Constitution in this election. All right, so no questions so far. People are coming in. The announcements come in so late that I'm not going to do an announcement for them. So there will be a video, and then I'll post a link to the video on Web Campus after this, right? Because it's not actually distributed out as fast as I would like anyways. All right, so let's talk about the Sage vs. State. Let's talk about chapters 7 and 8. We're starting with the executive, right? The executive has a number of roles, right? The governor has a lot of roles, and we're going to cover it today. So I'm glad we're doing this today, right? That why is our governor doing so much, right? And there are some questions, right? There's a question about pardons. Excuse me one second. There's a question about pardons, right? And that question, right, is going to cover a certain aspect, right, that we will talk about today, is that the governor has to sign every pardon. And that's true for all states, right? But in Nevada, the way that they decide pardons is they have a vote, right? And you have to get a majority vote on the board of pardons. But the governor has to be part of that majority, right? He's a single veto. Right, he can say anyone doesn't get a pardon, right? And the reason why Nevadans wanted it that way is because the governor has to sign a veto, and therefore the governor is ultimately responsible for what happens if someone who is pardoned goes out and commits a crime, right? The accountability is there. So when we talk about one of the questions that we're going to discuss, right, that's the discussion, right? Do we want to stop the governor from being able to have sort of ultimate say over who gets pardoned, or do we want that accountability, right? So you have the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, the secretary of state, the treasurer, and the comptroller, and then this idea of a plural executive. The idea of a plural executive is that the governor doesn't appoint his staff, right? And this is true for most states today, but also the lieutenant governor and the governor of Nevada could be of different parties. You vote for them separately, which means that the lieutenant governor can be opposed to the behavior of the governor, right? There's a plural executive. They're all independently elected offices. Also, we see like attorney generals, there is a Republican bias. The attorney generals are more likely to be Republican, right? Sort of this, unfortunately, it's sort of overused concept of law and order. Republicans do have more public trust when it comes to enforcement of the law, right? And that's one of the things that we'll talk about like in these offices, right? We expect Republican candidates to be more harsh when it comes to punishment, when we expect liberal candidates to seek out sort of restorative justice or other means or looking at systemic issues when they're dealing with justice. And so that leads voters to vote for Republican attorney generals more often. A slight bias, not a huge bias, a slight bias. All right. So if you want to be the executive, you only have to be 25 years old. You have to be a qualified elector, which just means you can't be a felon. You have to live in the state long enough, right? And a president of the state of the previous 2 years, right? You only have to live here for 2 years, and you only have to be 25. The other stuff about qualified elector, very rarely will you see someone not be qualified, right? Right? If someone has no formal education, right, they're more than likely going to be excluded, not legally, but de facto. The Nevada executive serves four-year terms, right? The same general election, right, which means that yes, right. So Sisolak will not be up for, is not in the ballot this year, right? 4-year terms. Okay. There are term limits, right? There are term limits to everyone in the executive branch. There are term limits to service in service in the state of Nevada. In 1970, there's a constitutional amendment. Governors can only serve 2 terms. And part of this, about this 2 terms, it can include the last 2 years of a predecessor's term, right? So Nevada has a rule where partial terms count as full terms. So if you are the deputy to an elected official, and a month before the next election, right, that individual is going to step down, you could step in that person's place. But when you step in that person's place, it counts as a full term. And you're only allowed to run for 2 terms, right? Which means that you could serve a month and a term, and it would still count as 2 full terms. So partial terms count as full terms. Except for judges, right, all statewide offices are limited to 2 terms, right, in 1996. The only judges can serve for a lifetime. We want them to have lots of experience. We want judges to stay in the same place for a while. One of the things that is an exception is the lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor is limited to 12 years or 3 terms, 3 4-year terms. Now, the thing about the lieutenant governor, it is considered a part-time position, right? The same way that the legislature sort of only comes in so much at the time, the lieutenant governor's responsibilities do not make up a full-time position. So they're allowed to serve more terms, right? Because it ends up being about the same, right? 3 part-time terms or 2 full terms. All right, how can a governor be removed from office, right? We know that they can be voted out, right? But Governor Sisolak's not up for vote right now, right? So I'm using him because, right, he is a very powerful governor. He's our governor, but also, right, he is running the COVID response. So because he's running the COVID response, we know that a lot of people are going to have a disdain for him, right? That's just a natural aspect. If you're in charge of fixing some sort of disaster, some people are going to be mad at you, right? There are people that are going to be mad that we're being forced to wear masks, right? That's a mandate from our governor, right? Other aspects about businesses shutting down, we know there's going to be disdain. What we did not see is a recall petition. Now, maybe it's just that we didn't expect the pandemic to last this long, right? Right, when we shut down in March, right, it was sort of expected to be a month, maybe 2, right? Historically, pandemics don't last this long. Usually there's some sort of immunity or herd immunity, right? We've seen none of that. So this is a very unique pandemic. Not only is it very problematic in its spread, right? And not only is it very political, unlike other pandemics, right? But it also has a long-lasting aspect of it, right? This is a much longer pandemic than pandemics of the past. The other part, right, is because people are unsymptomatic for a period of time, right, there's all of that. So we could have said, right, over the summer, the governor is not doing his job, he's putting too many restrictions on us, and they could have had a recall petition. And you need 25% of voters, of registered voters in each district. We did not see that happen, right? There's no recall for him on this election. Impeachment is for misdemeanors or malfeasance in office, right? This can happen in the legislative branch. The other thing is, right, because the legislative branch can't convene, right? The earliest that impeachment could happen is next February, right? But what they could do is they could have a trial in the upper house, and it requires right, the lower house just needs a simple majority, and then a trial in the upper house. And we've seen this, right? We had an impeachment of Trump, right? Clinton went through an impeachment process, and Nixon went through an impeachment process, right? They all went through this process. And you go through a trial, and they're trying to decide if this individual did something wrong. But we know from impeachments, because you have lived through one very recently, right, that they're very political, right? Proving someone did something wrong isn't really the way for impeachments to work. What you have to do is convince enough of the people in the party that they should impeach that individual, right? And right now, the people in the state house have no interest in impeaching Governor Sisolak, right? He is going to get all of the reward and all of the punishment for what's happening in COVID, right? So the legislature wants nothing to do that. They're not going to impeach him. Impeachment, he could be removed from office, but what they could also do is disqualify him from future elections. We might see that happen, but we also might see Governor Sisolak not run for re-election, right? The pandemic has sort of skewed people's behavior. And then the last part of is resignation, right? Anyone can quit their job in Nevada at any time. We're a right to work state, so you can quit whenever you want. The governor can do the same thing and resign. There are certain roles for the governor, right? He appoints the executive branch officials. So this is a very powerful aspect of the governor. And why is it so powerful is because he's appointing these branch officials, and they actually run the day-to-day aspects. Many of you might remember that our mayor, the mayor of Las Vegas, or maybe not your mayor, right, but the mayor of Las Vegas, right, because you might live in Henderson or Boulder Creek or whatever, she went on TV and she suggested that casinos should open, right? That was an argument she made, right? And how they handle that, right? She went on national television. One of the things that became very clear to the nation, but that was very clear to us in the state, right, or who study the state, is that the mayor doesn't have actually any power over the casinos in Las Vegas, right? The casinos are run by a commission, a gaming control board, and a gaming commission, right? The gaming control board and the gaming commission. So the chief executive, the governor, appoints members of these commissions, and they decide when casinos open. They decide what safety measures, what capacity, right? It's not just the governor deciding sort of ad hoc or just whatever whims happen to hit him. He has a commission that's working with a safety team that's trying to figure out the best way to move forward, right? The Public Works Board includes NVE, right? So NVE is a public municipality, right? So the decisions on costs of energy, on how to distribute energy, right? Las Vegas is very unique, and as if there's a power shortage, right? The homes are cut off first, and the businesses stay on, right? Because of the way the casinos work, right? Whereas if you're from a more rural area, the businesses will actually use power first because they have generators, and the homes will be second, right? So we have a different order of behavior in this Las Vegas area, which also applies to most of the state, right? But so much of the activity happens here, even though the governor and the capital are in Carson City. The next part, right, is that there are legislative checks on the executive, right? All proposed executive regulations are up for review. So what happens is, the same way that the president of the United States has an executive order, the governor, Steve Sisolak, he has a executive regulation where he decides to engage in a new practice, right? Remember, he is in control of all of the people who enforce the law, who enforce the laws, who enforce the bureaucracy, right? All the people, the DMV and public safety, right? How do we enforce these things? Do we really crack down on certain behaviors, right? Are we going to stop writing jaywalking tickets right now? What are certain aspects about the enforcement that apply, right? And that's an executive regulation, right? The legislative branch can suspend regulations, right? If it seems like the president is doing more than he can. We might see the legislative branch next year, depending on who gets elected, say that he has exceeded his legal authority, his statutory authority, by mandating masks, right? One of the things about mask use is why we have a lot of scientific evidence that it helps prevent the spread of disease, right? You protect others by wearing a mask, right? Our Constitution, our federal Constitution, and our state Constitution are written in such a way that there is a legal argument that we can't be forced to wear masks, right? This is part of the, without sort of agreeing with anyone's side, legally, there is an argument to be made about whether or not you should have to wear masks, right? Are the laws set up that way? Remember, this isn't moral or normative about right and wrong. This is, do the laws allow the executive, the governor, to force mask wear, right? And that's not as clear, right? We haven't had something like this in the last 100 years. So because we haven't had this issue, the courts are going to be trying to figure this out. And so you might see in February, March of next year, the legislative branch, hopefully we're not still in this position in February, March of next year, right? But they might review what authority, right, does the executive have over some of these mandates. And more than likely, a lot of states will go to higher courts and then we'll get some sort of decision. But the decisions, because courts are so slow and the legislature is so slow, we might actually get answers about whether or not mask mandates are constitutional in like 3 years, when it doesn't matter, right? A lot of times when we get answers in courts, it's so past the point, it's just a point of clarity for it, right? There was a court case, I'm gonna go off a little bit for a second. There's a court case of a student who, because students used to be able to smoke in school, that's not really the point. A student who was asked if she was smoking, she said no. The principal went in her bag, her purse, and found cigarettes and suspended her, right? And then eventually it goes to the Supreme Court and it's decided that she had a right to privacy in her purse and he did not have a right as principal to search it because there wasn't any right. She had a Fourth Amendment right against illegal search and seizure, right? Just because you're in a school doesn't mean that they can search your bag, right? That case is important, right? A lot of people believe that children don't have rights. Everyone has rights all the time, right? You don't give up your rights when you come onto a campus or into a school, right? Obviously, they're violated quite often. But the point about that story is, by the time that case was settled, that high school student had graduated college and had children, right? That it takes a very long time for the courts to decide these things. But there might be a part of this that the legislature wants to pick up next year. We will see. And there's always a check on the executive, right? We're a democracy. Checks on the executive are part of our democracy, our constitutional democracy. All right. So this is a question we're going to be talking about, right? There is a 9-member board of the Pardon of Commissioners. You need 5 votes or a majority of people abstain, right? You need the majority, and we have very few abstentions, right? But you need the majority of votes, right? The governor has a veto power and there is no override. So if 8 of the 9 people, right, the governor is one of those 9 people. If the governor says, I will not pardon this individual, then there is no pardon for that individual. And the reason why this was originally established is because the governor's name is signed to every pardon. And if there's ever an accountability issue, it is the governor, as it stands now, it is the governor saying they are taking responsibility and they believe this person should be pardoned for whatever they're convicted of, right? And they believe they will not be a danger to society once released, right? Depending on the pardon. There is a question that would remove the governor as having to be the majority, and then it would just take 5 members. But as we discussed in the earlier part, right, the governor appoints 2 to 3 of these members, right? So the governor doesn't just have a veto, he also has his own group of people that he appointed to be in that, right? So he still has a lot of influence. So the question that is on the ballot will alleviate some of the personal bias of the governor, but there will still be a lot of impact by the executive. So it's a sort of very nuanced shift, right? I think it's a very great question for us to discuss because it's nuanced and we can get into the details of it, which we will do on Thursday. The executive has a lot of roles. So we're going to start talking about the executive as the chief of state. So the chief of state is a symbolic function. The first function, right, is a symbolic function. When you have other leaders come in, it is the governor who greets the president, it's the governor who greets foreign ambassadors, right? Whenever someone comes in, it is the job of the governor to meet them and present them in such a way that makes connections, right? Even though we have a rules-based system, right, every governor is trying to get a little more, right? You want a little more funding, you want a little more connection, right? You want a better, right, caucus in the federal government, right? You always want to do some schmoozing, right? It is not unique to Nevada, right? Governors always have to, as part of their job, be very, right, be very open and accepting of goodwill, right, and sort of meet people in, right. In Nevada, the lieutenant governor also runs sort of a tourism board, so, right, you have these aspects as well, right, but you meet these other things, and then ribbon cutting ceremonies. Ribbon cutting ceremonies are very strong signaling aspects. When a bridge or a highway is out, elected officials will show up for that ribbon cutting ceremony so they can claim credit, right? There's a book by Mayhew, it's called Congress, the Electoral Connection, right? And one of the things about ribbon cutting ceremonies is everyone there can say, look, I contribute to this. I was part of this good thing that happened, right? That's something I did, you should re-elect me, right? So that credit claiming is very important for all elected officials. In Nevada, right, the executive, the governor, is also the chief legislator. And what do I mean by that? Because we know, right, that the executive branch doesn't write laws. The legislative branch writes laws. They are the legal branch, the legislative branch, right? So they make the laws, right? When we talk about the executive as the chief legislator, we're talking about the ability of the governor to say which laws are going to be addressed. And we talk about this as agenda setting. He sets the legislative agenda. And he does this in the State of the State address. So the governor, I don't think he's going to do it anytime soon. But next year, what he will probably do after the elections, before Congress, before the legislative branch in Nevada gets going, what he will do is he'll say, these are the things that I think are big issues. These are things I don't think are big issues. So if the legislative branch pursues these things that I care about, I will sign them. I won't veto them. I will pass them through. But if you try to bring up these issues, I will veto these issues without saying exactly those words, right? He'll make it clear what's important to him. And all presidents do this in the State of the Union, right? What's important, what are they against, right? And what that does is it signals to the legislative branch that if you want to pass something in that term, right, in that legislative session, it has to align with the executive, right? Remember, in Nevada, you only have a short period of time, right? You only have 120 days, right? You have 4 months starting in February to pass all laws, and it has to include a budget that lasts 2 years. And that budget clearance, right, getting that budget passed takes about 90 days. So any laws that we want passed by the legislative branch have to happen in the last 30 days of that session, right? It's very difficult, right? So if you know the governor's going to veto it anyways, then why bother, right? Why not work on the things that the governor will work with you? And that makes him a legislator in the sense that he's setting the agenda of what can be discussed. He's limiting the number of topics. The other part is this idea of central clearance. So in Nevada, we have what's called a balanced budget. We have to spend every dollar that we take in taxes, and we can't go into debt, right? The state of Nevada cannot go into debt. So one of the things that has happened is our budget lasts from the start of 2020, the fiscal year 2020, to the beginning of the fiscal year 2022. It's a 2-year budget, it has to be balanced. We are way down on funds, right? We had to spend all this money, these businesses closed, all this tax revenue was lost, right? So that at some point there has to be a reckoning in cutting down costs, because the state of Nevada can't borrow money. It cannot be in debt, right? That's what a balanced budget means. You can't go into debt, you cannot borrow money. So what happens is every time a budget request goes through, it goes to the governor's office, right? If any legislator or any district wants something, it has to go through the executive. And what's going to happen next year, as they're trying to make up for this budget loss, this revenue loss of this year, is they're going to start saying no to everything, even requests that are fairly reasonable, right? You need new technology in your classroom? Too bad, you have to pay for that yourself, right? Why do elementary school teachers and teachers, K through 12 teachers, buy so much of their stuff? Because their departments and their schools say, no, we're not going to pay for that, right? So much of this is designed in the sense that at the end of the 2 years, you have to be very careful with money. But then, right, as I'm sure some of you do the same thing, right? You're very careful when you don't have it. And then when you get your new money, right, your new paycheck or this 2-year budget that Nevada has, is then at the beginning of it, then maybe you're not as careful, right? And so there's always projections, there's always aspects, but because they all go through the governor can influence the controller to reject requests or to not allow certain aspects that don't seem relevant, right? And that gives them a lot of power in what aspects. And then the governor's budget is usually the budget that gets accepted, right? And this is true for the federal government as well, right? Why is it that the president's budget and the governor's budget, by and large, are the budgets of the government, right? It is because only the executive has the offices and the personnel to do that, right? While the legislative branch was at home, right? Remember, in Nevada, we have a citizen legislature. They're at home doing what we're doing. They're not doing something different. They're not at work in Congress. They're not at work in their state houses. They're living the same lives we are. This entire time, right, the governor's staff have been working on a new budget that's going to fill in the next gap, right? So the executives have been working on budgets, and then what they do is they give the budget to the legislative branch and say, okay, you decide how money is spent, but here's a budget that includes everything. And then you get some minor tweaks, you get some changes based on who's elected. But by and large, 90 to 95% of the budget is set by the governor, right? How is money going to be spent, right? That's also why it's so important, right? Not just the presidential elections, but the governors and the state house elections, because you're determining how money is spent in your local community, right? Sisolak is a liberal. He's going to dedicate more money to services than his Republican or conservative counterpart, right? So local elections very important, right? We'll talk about this on the sample ballot, right? If those of you who have seen your sample ballot, it is like, 40 different votes, right? I'm not going to go over the judges, right? But it is very important to look at the ones that impact your life. Normally, I would be talking about the Great Recession, which was 2008 to 2012, but we're going to talk about the pandemic because it's much more impactful for us, right? And employment is higher because of this, right? Unemployment was very high in the Great Recession, right? Which leads to this problem of austerity versus raising taxes. In the pandemic, we only have two options. We can choose austerity, right? We can tighten our belts, which means less services, right? No unemployment. So the state of Nevada, right, there was supposed to be some unemployment add-in, right, where people got like $300 extra a week for a certain number of weeks. Nevada is the last state, and they still haven't done it because they've been arguing that they should be allowed to take that money and put it into other services because everything is shorted right now, right? So austerity is tightening your belt whenever you can. And Nevada kind of has to do that because, as I said, we're a balanced budget. The only other way to get around this is to raise taxes. And Nevadans, more than most places, have fought against raising taxes very strongly, right? We do not have a state income tax. And for those of you that have only lived in Nevada, right, you have federal taxes, so your paycheck gets taxed normally, and then I was from California, which has one of the highest state income taxes. And then another 5 to 8% of your income goes to the state, right? So depending on how much you make, right, 18 to 25% of your income goes to the federal government, and then 5 to 8% goes to the state, right? And I mean, if you make more, it's a higher percentage, right? But we'll talk about taxes later, right? So Nevadans don't want that. Right? They really don't want income tax, right? We already have a high poverty. We already have problems of low unemployment right now. So raising taxes would be the worst case. But the other part is the only time you can raise taxes is during a legislative session. So by the time we did raise taxes, it would be July of next year, which means it would be too late, which means the state of Nevada only has one option, and that's austerity. All it can do is tighten its belt. That's the only choice it has. And when the governor only has one tool, which is tight belting, right, it's going to be some very hard extremes, right? Some hard extremes, especially because unlike the federal government, the state of Nevada cannot borrow money. All right. The executive is the commander-in-chief of the National Guard, right? He appoints adjutant general. We talked about the National Guard when we're talking about segregation, right? The National Guard does not belong to the country, it belongs to the state, right? The National Guard belongs to Nevada. The governor is the only one who can declare a state of emergency and then activate the National Guard to do something, right? Now, normally when we have a disaster, right, the National Guard comes and fills sandbags for flooding, or they cut debris to stop fires, right? When we have high winds, they help board up windows, right? But right now, right, the only tools that the governor has don't really fit with the situation we're dealing with, right? You can't activate this. And then the president, or the governor, right, the governor says, like, is the chief of the party. Right now, right, the leader of the Democratic Party in Nevada is Governor Sisolak, right? And as we talked about, he's sort of popular. It depends, right? We don't have great polling yet. He's not really up for re-election. But if his popularity is low at the end of this, because people feel he went to too much of an extreme in this response, then every Democrat in the state is going to get punished with him because he is a leader of the party. We call this down ticket voting, right? If I vote for a Democrat at the top, right? If you vote for a Democrat as president, you're much more likely, right, in that sort of the straight ticket voting of voting all the way down, which means that if it's unpopular, right, if the person at the top, like the governor or the president is unpopular and you're not going to vote for that person, then you also don't vote for those other people down. Or, as we've seen in the past, you just don't vote at all, right? If you don't like your guy and the other guy's not a good alternative, you may not vote. Now, we have some data that's not happening this time, right? There have been long lines in early voting, and I think something like 40 million people have already voted. So it's been like a very successful early voting strategy across the country. All right, so the lieutenant governor is part-time. They are the acting governor during vacancies. So it has always been the case that if the governor, right, remember we're talking about 1860s, right, moving forward, sort of 19th century. If the governor leaves the state, right, and as governors have to, right, governors have to go to Congress, or they have to go visit the president, or whatever they have to do. It used to be that it was weeks. They would be gone for weeks, right? Travel was not as fast, right? You don't have the car invented until around 1910, right? And so because of that, right, you can have an absence from the state, right? And what would happen is as the governor was leaving, because all of a sudden the lieutenant governor is in charge, as soon as the governor crosses state lines, the lieutenant governor would take charge and try to make as many changes as possible. Right, this sort of while the parents are gone party type mentality, right? As soon as the governor leaves, let's change as much as we possibly can. Because remember, the lieutenant governor and the governor are not elected together, which means they can be in different parties. So if you're a Republican, right, a lieutenant governor, and this Democratic governor leaves the state, they're gone, and you become governor, you might roll back protections, or you might shut down certain things, or you might behave differently, right? So what happens is eventually we come up this difference of an effective absence. Are you actually incapacitated? And this makes sense, right? But also it doesn't apply as much, right? This absence from the state is no longer really matters as much, right? With teleconferencing and flights, it's not as big an issue. But effective absences have created some new aspects, right? We didn't really talk about the 25th Amendment. The likelihood that an elected official will die in office is higher because of this pandemic, but right, it's not really worth discussing hypotheticals, right? But both cases provide a clear set of rules for secession if the incumbent dies, right? The government of the United States and the government of Nevada both have rules about what to do when someone is incapacitated or can no longer serve in office or dies, right? There's no confusion about that, right? There has been, for a very short period of time in our country, right, there was some idea that, right, if Trump was gone, who knows what everyone would do, right? But in reality, we know exactly what happened. Mike Pence would become president, right? The rules are very clear. The lieutenant governor would take over for the governor if governor says something happens where he's incapacitated. That's just the way that the process works. The other part is just like the vice president, the lieutenant governor casts a tie-breaking vote in the Senate, right, in the state Senate, and then they are the chair of the Commission on Tourism, right? So while the governor is the goodwill ambassador, they meet with elites, right? They meet with other governors and presidents, right? The lieutenant governor helps guide tourism in our state, right? The Commission on Tourism is right. They're the commission that comes up with what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, which is no longer a very popular slogan, right? But all of the advertising to come to Nevada, right? All the advertising you see to come to a specific state comes from the Commission of Tourism, right? And for us, it's led by the lieutenant governor. The attorney general is also elected separately. They are not legally required to be an attorney, right? So as we're talking about this before, the only time you can be in a high-level legal office and not have severe qualifications is if you are part of a party or you're appointed. However, right, even though you don't have to be an attorney to be attorney general in the state of Nevada, it is pretty rare that they don't have a law degree, right? Typically they have a law degree, but also a lot of people in politics have a law degree, right? It's not that hard to find someone in this role. Typically the person has a lot of experience working as an attorney, as a prosecutor. Typically prosecutors become attorney generals. Public defendants don't have the same popularity when it comes to political offices. They are a member of the Board of State Prison Commissions, Board of Examiners, and Board of Pardons, right? So they are an elected official on the Board of Pardons, right, that can vote against the governor. They are responsible for defending the state or prosecuting cases at the Nevada Supreme Court and the US Supreme Court. So whenever a person with standing argues that a law or that the state has violated their rights, right, this individual will go to the courthouse. Whenever a individual claims that a state law violates the federal constitution, then the attorney general has to go to the Supreme Court and make those cases. If the Supreme Court picks it up, which we'll talk about when we cover the federal Supreme Court, right? The federal Supreme Court does not have to consider any cases they don't want to. In fact, there's no rules that says the US Supreme Court has to take up any cases. They could just stop functioning altogether whenever they wanted. They choose to take up cases. It's a very unique system in the United States. All right, the rest of the executives, right, you have the Secretary of State, right? The Secretary of State is the custodian of the state's records. I'm checking. Okay, sorry, I just now checked this question. Yes, we are on track according to the syllabus. I will post an assignment, and then what I will do is I will post an assignment and we'll be on track. We're behind on assignments by 2 or 3, but I'm just gonna provide you with some other opportunities, or I might just add in some other stuff that makes it easier for you to get there. But we are on track based on the lectures. Okay, so as part of Secretary of State, you ensure that all elections are certified, right? That's the job of the Secretary of State. And usually it's not a very contentious issue, right? Secretary of States have been doing this for a long time. If you go to a Secretary of State website for Nevada, California, for any state, you will find all of this information about voting, right? There's this treasure trove. They keep records on everything. Who voted, right? Who voted? How did neighborhoods break down in their partisanship, right? Were they leaning more Republican or Democrat, right? What percentage of votes came in by mail versus in person versus early voting, right? One of the reasons why those of us in sort of political science research are less concerned about a contested election is because these Secretary of States, they are not tied to the federal government. They are doing the elections in their states, right? Which means they are certifying each state's election. Each state is certifying its own election. So the idea that it would be rejected, right, would be saying that these individuals didn't do their job. And the Secretaries of State have always been unified in getting as many people to vote and making sure voting was accessible, right? And making sure that the vote was counted properly. That's the biggest part of their job, right? They have all these other activities that they do, right? But that's the biggest part of their job. And so because of that, we're going to see them become very active in the next couple of weeks, right? Making sure that everything is clear and transparent and as much as we possibly can is done quickly, right? Most states can start counting ballots already, right? They can open, sort, and count the ballots already. So we might see in a lot of states, there's enough early voting, right when the polls close, we might have a lot of responses from certain states. But 2 battleground states, Wisconsin and I want to say Pennsylvania, they can't start counting their mail-in or early votes until the polls close, which means that they have a lot of mail-in voting and a lot of them allow early vote or mail-in votes to be postmarked the day of the election, even if they're not received the day of the election. So when you're doing all of this, right, there is going to be some complication, but that individual, that Secretary of State, is going to really take their staff and make sure that there's as much clarity and as much efficiency as there possibly can be. The treasurer deposits all the state funds, and the controller is the bookkeeper, right? So you want to think about it as an in and out, right? The treasurer brings in all the money and puts it into the accounts where they're supposed to be. The controller spends the money. right? So anytime a request comes in for funding for some reason and it goes to the state, the controller has to keep a good book about what money is going where. And then if someone has gotten money, they then go back and audit to make sure that money is going to the right place and the right things, right? The controller's job is not just to make sure they're keeping track of how much money is spent, right? Because remember, we have a balanced budget. So if we're spending too much this month, we've got to cut back on what we're spending next month until we get back on track, which is going to be impossible in the pandemic, but we'll see how that impacts next year, right? There might be a massive decline in services next year when you have, right, if we are moving past the pandemic, one of the strange things is as we move past it, there's going to be such a cut in services, right, that there might be 80 to 90 people in a classroom instead of the social distancing, right, just to make up for all the shortfalls of funding. Not in here, UNLV is funded differently, but in a K-12 system, in high schools and elementary schools and middle schools. So the controller is making sure funding is going to the right place, and then the treasurer, right, is trying to make sure all the money goes to the right place. So these two work together, and they have jobs that are separate, so they can only make sure one side of it, right? You want to make sure that the treasurer is making sure all the money is going to the right place, and the controller is spending the money, right, and making sure the money is spent appropriately. All right, that's actually all of Chapter 7, right? I want you to know the offices. I want you to understand what the offices do, right? And, right, because I have to have 25% of the questions on the exam, right, look for questions that can be very clear, right? Because the problem with the state of Nevada is a lot of the questions in the text, it's not clear about what I should be expecting of you. But I do expect you to know the roles and to be able to tie in what role is what thing, right? If I ask you, you know, what part of the executive's job, I'm gonna go back for a second. So I'm gonna go to the role of the governor, right? If I ask you about what part of the governor's role deals with the budget, right? Then I would expect you to know that I'm referring to the chief legislator, right? But I'm saying, okay, what part of the governor's role deals with, right, meeting presidents and other governors, right? That's right, that is the chief of state, right? What role applies to what aspect of being governor, right? So there are a few questions there, right? And then obviously, right, what about the budget, right? Why is it that the governor has so much control of the budget? Because the governor has the staff, which we'll actually talk about the staff later on, but it may not be in this exam, right? But the important part is, why is it that the governor gets his budget through? Because they have the staff to write a budget, right? An elected official, a state official in Nevada might have one or two people, that's it. That's not enough people to do a full state budget, right? They don't have the offices and the personnel. Okay, one second. So now we're going to talk about the Nevada judiciary. And so we've talked about this in the past about those territorial courts, right? They dealt with mining claims, right? We talked about mine leaching and all of these other aspects. So at the beginning of the Nevada territory and then the Nevada state, there were two aspects. Is one, because mining claims are complex, the court started to be complex, right? You had more complexity in the claims, and so the courts become more complex, they become more nuanced, right? We haven't talked about this idea of stare decisis, which you heard about in the Senate hearings, in the Supreme Court nominee Senate hearings, right? This idea of accepting precedent, what precedent exists. And so mining claims gave a lot of precedent, but what they also did was show that the courts had very little credibility, right? If you're a mining interest and, right, if you're a large mining interest and you have a big operation and a smaller mining interest comes to the court and asks for something, it might be very clear that that court's siding with the larger company through some kickback or bribe, right? There's a lot of bribery, there's a lot of inappropriate judgments in the Nevada courts in the beginning period. But from 1864, when Nevada becomes a state, to 1984, it's relatively calm, right? The judicial branch becomes relatively calm because there's not that much to decide, right? There's an effort to get rid of as much bribery and corruption as they can in the state, right? And so what ends up being is a very calm, dry courthouse, right? The other thing is, a lot of times when we think about a courthouse, we're thinking about a criminal courthouse, right? You have people who are very emotional, right? Guilty or not, going to jail or not. Most courthouses are not run that way, right? The criminal court is actually only a small part of the courts, the judicial branch, right? You have a lot of cases that are much more detailed, right? If you're in a civil court, or if you have one corporation suing another, or if you have a company suing the state, it's not as impassioned, right? It's more about the arguments and presenting evidence, and it's a little bit more dull, but also a lot more detailed. And so you have these very calm courts. Courts in themselves outside of criminal court are very calm, right? There's a lot of just discussion and checking on facts and making sure that they're all on the same page. And then in 1984, you have this problem. In 1984, you have this problem where you start having elections that are contentious. You've always had, and you'll see on the ballot, this idea of none of these candidates. It has always been possible in Nevada for certain candidates to say, I don't want any of these people. I'm going to check a box that says none of these candidates. And that means I don't want either of them in office. And as they're moving forward, you have, right, in 1992, 18% voted none of these candidates, and in 1996, 21% voted. But what happens is in 1992 and 1996, right, none of these starts to become the most popular voted for. And what happens if you have a lot of none of these votes, and does that mean, right, if the plurality of votes goes to none of these candidates, does that mean we should exclude those candidates? Make sure I'm not, okay. But what happens is when they're voting none of these, if none of these gets the most votes, it is meaningless, right? It is a signal to those individuals that neither of them were popular. But if I get 10% of the vote, and my competitor, the challenger, gets 9% of the vote, and none of these gets 81% of the vote, I win, right? The way it's legally set up. Even though Nevadans clearly rejected both candidates, someone has to win the election. And this creates a problem for the courthouse, because they're saying, if none of these candidates can't win, then why is it on a ballot? Why do you have someone on a ballot that cannot win? Why do you have an option on the ballot? Why are you letting us vote in a way that doesn't impact the outcome? And it becomes very clear that the judicial system has to figure out an answer. And what they say is a person has to win the elected office. And so none of these is going to remain, but people know, right? One of the claims the judicial branch makes is that people know when they vote none of these, that that's not going to be the outcome. What it is a signal that it's more important to those individuals to signal to both candidates that they were unpopular, right? It's a signaling mechanism, but you're still not voting for the winner, right? And we talked about strategic voting, right? There are a couple of offices where you can vote for none of these. What is more important to you? Is it more important that you signal that you hate all of the candidates, or is it more important that you know that your vote helps determine the outcome, right? And both of those are important, right? We talked about principled voting versus strategic voting more than once already, right? Are you going to vote principle, right? So you want to vote Green Party or Libertarian Party, or are you going to vote strategically? And both of these are valid options, right? I have a professor who taught me to get my master's, who teaches at CSU Sacramento, right in California, and he never votes for president. He always writes in the name of a felon that he believes was wrongly convicted. That's what he does with his presidential vote. And so that has value to him to signal, even though, who knows who's going to read that, right? That has value to him, right? And so that's when we're talking about principled voting is not a thrown away vote if your principles matter to you more than possibly impacting the outcome, right? Principled voting isn't flawed. It's just unlikely to happen because strategic voting is how people work when they go into a ballot box, right? When we talked about why third parties don't get elected, right? Often it's because strategic voting takes over principled voting, right? Humans are naturally pragmatic. You want to do the right thing, or you want to do the thing that ties to your principles, but you also want to do the thing that's effective, and your brain typically tells you to go with the effective aspect. By 1994, 75% of those polled did not have much confidence in the Supreme Court, right? This was in part because of this election, but also because there were more and more issues that are contentious, right? Remember that in the 90s, you start having a lot of contentious issues about right to life, right? Whether or not an individual has a right to have an abortion or use contraceptives. The right to die becomes a 1990s issue, right? You have this issue. It is now legal in some cases in California and a few other states for someone who is terminally ill to end their life, right? I talked about this in other courses, right? Obviously, if you're depressed, do not seek out counseling, right? I'm not suggesting that, right? But we have changed the laws, right? And that's very contentious, right? If I were to tell you in the 50s or 60s, no one accepted that. But now, because we have, right, all of these things to keep you alive, but cancers are still terminally ill, right? We have shifted in this. And that's very contentious to say, right, this person's terminally ill and excruciating, maybe they should have that choice. Very contentious in the 90s. Right to life, pro-choice pro-life, very contentious in the 90s. And then we start adding things like, right, gay surprise, right? Do you have a legal protection if someone surprises you, right? This becomes a law, right? In the 1990s, it becomes a law that if someone surprises you by a sexual advance and they are gay and you didn't know that and you murder them, that's a self-defense mechanism. There are laws in the books in many states, not in this state, but in many states, right? Other aspects, right? In the 1990s is when you start to see Republicans move towards the Defense of Marriage Act. And the Defense of Marriage Act says that marriage is between a man and a woman, right? That's what the act says, right? And we even have a question on, I think it's question 1, and that's coming up in the sample ballot. Is this question 2? Yeah, question 1's. So question 2, right, very clearly says we're going to remove this language that was added less than 10, 12 years ago that said marriage is between a man and a woman. These are contentious issues of the 90s and the 2000s, and they caused the court to have less and less popular support because they're not issues that people will accept regardless of the law, right? Most of the time, the courts accept the decisions, right? How is it that Nevada has a constitutional ban on same-sex marriage, but same-sex marriage occurs in Nevada? Because the courthouses have to follow Obergefell v. Hodges, right? They have to follow the Supreme Court's, the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions. Well, that makes the state Supreme Court of Nevada very unpopular, right? And so that contention limits their ability to do that. And we have much more contentious issues in the courts than we've had in the past, right? Segregation has always been there, but if you think about it, the discussion of trans rights is a 21st century issue. The discussion of same-sex marriage is a 21st century issue. The discussion of individuals not being discriminated based on their sexual preference is a 21st century issue. These are new issues that's come out in the 90s that make it harder for the courts to stay non-political, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right, while she was an icon, right, she also created a lot of tension between the courts and the public, right? She spoke her dissents from the bench. That's what made her an icon, but it pushed the courts into the political sphere. All right, so how does it actually work, right? Hold on. Okay. So how does the court system actually work? The first part is that you have to start at a court of original jurisdiction, right? That in the Nevada Supreme Court, right, it's an appellate and original jurisdiction. There aren't a lot of cases that go right to the state Supreme Court, the Nevada Supreme Court. Usually what happens, and I like that it goes up, but it kind of is confusing. Usually the way that it starts is you start in a justice or a municipal court. And these courts just have a certain amount of jurisdiction, right? And what I mean is, what issues start there, right? If you have a family issue, it starts in a family court, in a municipal family court, right? That's the original jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction is where is the first place that the law should go to deal with that issue, right? What's the first courthouse that this case should go to? And there are some cases that go straight to the Nevada Supreme Court. There are some, but typically they don't go that. And then because it's a state Supreme Court, the decisions are final with the caveat that if you can find a federal aspect to that case, that you can try and move that into a federal law and go to the US Supreme Court. Between the justice, right, when you go to a courthouse, you're going to a local justice municipal court, right? Between that and the state Supreme Court is an appellate court. But the district courts in Nevada don't do as much. Most cases go from local cases. If they're going to go up, they can go straight to the Supreme Court, the Nevada Supreme Court. The only time, right, that the Supreme Courts, both in the state of Nevada and the federal government, will not answer a case, well, they say we're not going to consider this case, it was something as a political question. Now, what does it mean to be a political question? It means that the issue isn't about constitutionality, right? A lot of times when the issue is not about constitutionality, it's that neither decision would really be based on the precedent of the cases that came before it, right? When a court says this is a political question, they're saying it doesn't really deal with constitutionality, it deals with politics. And politics, right, is involving people's preferences. But courts don't deal in preference, right? They deal in precedent, what cases have been decided before, right? And constitutionality. What are the actual words of the Constitution, right? Those are the two things that a judge runs by, right? What does the Constitution say, right? Whether you're an originalist, right? Like the conservative originalist where you just exact words, or you're an interpretivist, right? What is the spirit of the Constitution if you're more liberal, like a Warren Court in the 60s and 70s? And then the laws that have, in cases that have happened before, right? There's a lot of discussion about Roe v. Wade, right? But that's one case. That's not the only case ever to deal with pro-life and pro-choice issues, right? That's not the only abortion case ever, right? So when people talk about overturning Roe v. Wade, that's not how the system works, right? So we're gonna see how this works and why is it that the discussion seems very problematic in the way we're discussing it. The Supreme Court can't just overturn a previous case. Like, that's not how it works. Okay. Hold on one second. I think we talk about this when we do this, but I'm going to come back to how an actual case works before we leave, so we get a little more clarity. But I want to give you more about it, and then I'm going to go through how a case starts at the local court and moves its way forward and how that works. But first, I want to explain all these other things. So, Supreme Court, the Nevada Supreme Court is elected. It's 6 years, it's staggered term, right? So I think we have one or two. I think we have one up for. There's always some up for election. I don't have a sample ballot in front of me, right? They are nonpartisan elections. So if you look at your sample ballot, for those of you that have gotten it already, there are a lot of things that say NP, that means nonpartisan. Typically, when we have judges, we try to make them nonpartisan. But if you see two people running, right, there are a lot of cases where the only person running, so you either vote for them or you don't, but it doesn't really matter, they're going to win. But even when you have nonpartisan elections, typically those two are more conservative or more liberal. There's a difference, conservative or liberal, in the two offices. So sometimes nonpartisan cues don't really help you, right? If you look at your sample ballot, you're like, oh, I'm going to vote Democrat all the way down, and then there's 30 things that say NP. Those require more research. And I'm actually not going to cover all of those. I don't think it's helpful. If you feel really powerfully about each judge, you can do that, but there's no way I could present them in a nonpartisan manner, right? I use very unique rules, right? One of the things about coming from California is you adopt these sort of weird voting rules. It's like, if there's two candidates, vote for the female first, and if there's two females, vote for the minority female first. But I don't expect you to follow those rules, right? Those are things that I grew up with that sort of impact me, but I'm not going to go through every judge because it may not matter to you the differences that they have, and I don't want to waste your time when we all have so many things that we have to do, even though we're sort of isolating and home a lot. There's somehow is more stuff to do now than there was when we were free to move around. Eligibility, you have to be 25 years of age. You have to be an attorney licensed to practice the law in Nevada. You have to be a 2-year state resident, and you have to have 15 years of legal experience. Now, here's the thing. 25 years old, the only way you could have 15 years of legal experience at 25 is if you got your law degree at 10. Now, it's not impossible. I think there are a couple of people who have PhDs at like 11 or 12. But those people aren't in state Supreme Court, so they're doing something very different, right? Most of them are in physics or something and making much more money than a Supreme Court justice. But that typically means that they're going to be significantly older, right? One of the things about this being a Supreme Court justice is they're typically in their 50s, 60s, 70s, right? They're on the end of their days, right? Not the end of their days, but the end of their career, right? They typically have a lot of experience and they know the law very well. right? Which is important for us, right? We want them to know the law very well because they're deciding when there's a disagreement, right? They don't just, it's not just a case, when you get to the Supreme Court, is that there exists some disagreement and they're sort of figuring out a solution to a problem where there's not clear consensus. In 1976, there was a constitutional amendment. There's no cap on Supreme Court justices. In 1999, the Supreme Court was expanded to 7 justices. So unlike other cases, we have 7 justices. In the state of Nevada and in the federal government, there is no cap on the number of justices. There's no cap, right? Why do we get this court pack question by the president? Why are they asking, candidate Biden and Kamala Harris about packing the court? It's because legally, it is possible, there's no limit, that either party can just start putting people in the Supreme Court. It has been a tradition, not a law, to maintain 9 in the federal government and 7 in our state, right? But it's just tradition. Now, during the time of FDR, there was this argument that they weren't efficient enough, and so they were going to pack the court. They were going to appoint as many justices as they wanted. The reason why we tend not to do that is because what you could do is you could just say, well, if there's 9 people already in the court, I'm just going to put 9 more people, and I'm going to appoint my people. And then you're always going to get the decision you want because all of your people become a majority of the court. Right? That's problematic. Right? That's problematic if you're in that situation. So court packing is an issue. Hopefully we don't see too much of it, but we may see some change in the size of the Supreme Court. But it's also very problematic and politically costly, right? If they put people in the Supreme Court, it would cost them. They might have other issues that they want to focus on. The Chief Justice in the Supreme Court is on a rotating basis on seniority. The thing about being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Nevada is because it rotates and because it doesn't pay more and it has more responsibility, often the individuals don't want to have that job, right? They don't want to become the Chief Justice, or there's no real vie for them for it. So sometimes when no clear person wants to step up and 2 people are sort of left behind it, right? They have decided it by coin toss, which tells you that it's not as important a role in the state of Nevada if you're going to be like, well, we'll just decide this by coin toss, right? Typically, you want a more engaged process, but there's no special ability that the Chief Justice has in the state Supreme Court, which is different from the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll talk about that later when it comes up. The other part about the Nevada Supreme Court is there's a lot of work, right? There's a lot of work. So they have 2 panels, right? 2 panels of 3 justices. 3 justices in Carson City in the northern panel and 3 justices in Las Vegas in the southern panel. When a case is very important or very nuanced, right, and it feels appropriate, all 7 justices will come together for that case. However, the Supreme Court handles 2,000 cases a year, right? 2,000 cases a year, almost 6 a day, right? Every day, right? Now, part of this is very easy. Sometimes it's very easy. They get all the documents, they put it together, they read through it, they say, okay, the 3 of us can clearly decide on this, right? Why are they hearing so many cases, right? It's because they don't have an intermediate court. Okay. When you want to appeal a decision, you can go directly to the state Supreme Court, right? Say you're in a civil disagreement, right? And someone decides against you, a judge decides against you, you can write an appeal and take it directly to the Nevada Supreme Court, right? And because you are involved in that case, they have to consider it. The Nevada Supreme Court has to consider every case it gets, which means it spends very little time on its cases, right? It spends very little time in its cases. It gets through multiple a day, right? It is working like a bureaucracy. It has a system where it gets through cases. Despite that, it has always had a backlog. Now, why are there so many of these cases? Why aren't they being solved? Because in the Supreme Court, you're not deciding guilt, right? Remember that appellate courts and high courts, like the Supreme Court, they're not saying, oh, is this person guilty or not? They're not reviewing the whole case. The questions in a Supreme Court case are about whether or not the law was violated by the individuals right, who are engaging in that practice, right? Right, I talked about that high school student whose bag was searched. Was your Fourth Amendment right violated, right? You are protected against illegal search and seizure, right? So the questions are not about whether or not you are guilty or innocent. That's not what those courts decide. It's whether or not everything was legally obtained. When it's a civil court, is this law clear enough, right, that you violated, right? Say you watered on the wrong day, right? And then you go to the court and you say, I'm appealing this decision because there's no way for me to know what days I'm supposed to water my lawn, right? And then you get to the court and they say, in your area, there's no signage, there was no mailer that was sent out, right? Typically, there's more than enough evidence, right? They're like, here's the mailer that you got, here's the other aspects. But if there's not, then the court would say, look, there wasn't enough provided information. Or the law is too vague, right? Every other Thursday, right? Problematic, right? That's why we don't do every others as much, right? We like Thursdays or Wednesdays, right? It's simpler that way. So when you're only dealing with those questions of the law, the cases can be handled very quickly, right? Was the law applied properly? All right, there are district courts. District courts can also be original jurisdiction. You have to have 10 years of legal experience. There are 10 judicial districts in 2012. We're going to see a huge shift after this because we just had the census. So probably a new edition will come out. They serve 6-year terms and they're statewide office. One of the things about a judge in the state of Nevada is you can be a judge in Carson City and live in Las Vegas. You can live hours away. You do not have to have a residence in your courthouse, in the court that you are residing over. It is a state because it's a statewide office. Now that is problematic. There have been cases where judges have lived in one side of the state and their district was on the other, and they have used government resources to get back and forth. But typically, people sort of just relocate. Nevada is not so difficult to relocate that people don't move around, right? There's a lot of movement within the state of Nevada, and it's typically easy to do so. It's very different from other states in that way, right? Cost of living is high just here, and then sort of balanced everywhere else in the state. Whereas in states like California, New York, you have extremely high and extremely low points of cost of living. So individuals don't always relocate. In the municipal and justice courts, these are your local courts. These are the courts where you go to first, right? This is your first point. So the first part, 6-year staggered terms, right? You don't want everyone coming in and being new. You want some what's called institutional experience. You always want someone with experience in there to help answer questions about how things work, right? You don't want to have a brand new staff every time. When you come in as a new judge, you want people there to explain how some certain things are working, certain traditions, right? The culture of the environment. You can be a justice of the peace, right? And the only actual requirement is a high school diploma or equivalent. Now, this is only true if you have a smaller population. Anything that's over 500,000 in the district, then you have to have a law degree, right? But you're not required to be an attorney in smaller population areas and less populated areas. When you have more populous areas, you have 5 years of legal experience, not that much experience. Why is it that low population areas? Because in the 20th century, there were very few attorneys. Very few people had a law degree. Now, as we go into the 80s and 90s, the 1980s and the 1990s, you see this explosion of law schools and law schools which don't have the same credentials, right? We talked about like nursing, right? Why are there so many medical assistants today unemployed? Because there was an explosion of schools that aren't necessarily well designed to do those jobs, right? Now, our school, right, the Boyd Law School, right, is a very well-known law school. But outside of the UNLV, there are 3 law schools in this community which are private and expensive and not always accredited, right? The Art Institute had to shut down because it didn't have the proper accreditation, which means it wasn't designing its courses and providing enough expertise in its professors to be justified to be called a school in the accreditation system, right? So there are a lot more attorneys now, but they're not of the same quality as they were in the past, right? These schools that make it easier, but also dilutes the sort of talent of the pool. A municipal court can be elected and it can be appointed. We have very few appointed judges, but usually when we're talking about a lower court is appointed. Most are elected, right? for those of you who have seen the sample ballot, and those, I'm sure all of you will look at it at some point, and I will show it to you on Thursday, right? There are a lot of judges up for election. Nevada likes to be involved in everything. We like to vote on everything, right? That is a big part of our direct democracy. All right. There are only a few ways that a judge can be removed, right? Obviously, resignation can occur, right? But, right, you also have a commission on judicial discipline. Now, this is 7 members. It is 2 judges, 2 members of the state bar, and 3 lay people. Now, in a lot of the commissions in Nevada, you include what are called lay people. And these aren't people that have no education, but they have people that do not have a legal education or do not work in the legal system. They might have a law degree or Juris Doctorate or something. The idea is that decisions have to be clear to everyone, right? It has to have enough clarity, because we're talking about attorneys and we're talking about people who could, right? If you look at the language that we see in some of the questions, and we look at some of the laws, they could very easily sort of bury the information, and what is often referred to as sort of a slur of attorney work is legalese, right? It's almost unreadable in the way it's set up. It's intentionally set up that way, and so this commission includes 3 lay people to make sure that they have a vote about something that's happening, right? Now, what has happened is very, very rarely what will happen is a judge will do something that's very inappropriate, but not illegal, right? They will have a relationship, right? They will have a relationship with someone who is much younger or who they have a control, right? They have power over, right? If you are a judge and you have a staff clerk and you date that staff clerk, that power position might be inappropriate. If you have someone who comes to your court for a case and then is someone who are close friends with, your drinking buddy, and you don't recuse yourself, right? Lay people might see that as a violation when legally you met these minimum standards. And so these lay people fill a very unique role in the state of Nevada. So removal, right, if the Judicial Discipline Board sort of suggests any things, right, or if they feel that something's happened, then they go through this removal process. We talked about recalls, right, 25% of the electorate, right, in each district, they can come out and say, we want you gone, and then a new election will occur. Right, recalls are very unlikely because that person could just win again. Most people don't pay that much attention to voting for judges anyways. More than likely is retiree, right? Is retiring, right? Judges have to have a lot of experience. It means they're typically older. But it also means when someone becomes a judge that because judges pay less than high-level attorneys, that they've made their wealth. Right? They've already made their wealth, and they're no longer looking to develop wealth. Now they're trying to develop sort of status. And so they take on a role where they make less. And so they're already, when someone becomes a judge, they're already closer to retirement than they were when they were an attorney. Right? It's a normal process. And then removal, right? If the Judicial Discipline Board can remove them, and then impeachment, judges can be impeached in the same way. Any reasonable cause, but it takes 2/3 majority of both houses. Any reasonable cause is sort of vague enough. But any time that it has even come up has been a very specific case, right? Usually they don't even have to impeach. Anytime a judge does something that's considered heinous enough for people to care about, usually that involves a resignation or criminal charges. And if you're charged criminally, you're removed from that post, right? This isn't that, right? And it's quite rare. Until 1976, whenever there was a vacancy, right? If a judge died in office, or someone retired, then the governor could appoint them until the next election. But now what happens is the Judicial Selection Committee is provided a 3-name list, right? The governor provides 3 names, and then among those, right, a suitable replacement is selected from them. However, not really don't mind it. Okay, so this is the last slide. I'm gonna get into this. However, if I were to give you 3 names and I say you get to pick, right? You get to pick of these 3 things, right? But I'm gonna give you a list of 3 things, right? And I'm gonna say, like, I'm a vegan, so it's a little weird, right? But I'm gonna choose 3 menu options, right? Say, like, at the end of this course, I'm gonna have a pizza party for all of you, right? Obviously that's not gonna happen because we can't even be close to each other, right? We can't, right? Social distancing and everything. And I offer you 3 things, right? I'm going to offer you, right, squid, right, raw chicken and pizza, right? You're going to pick pizza, right? Obviously, you're going to pick pizza, right? Obviously, you're not going to pick those other two options. One might kill you, and the other one, right? I mean, maybe you pick squid. I don't know. Maybe that's a delicacy, right? But the class is going to pick pizza. I didn't really provide you with three options. I picked something, and then I created two alternatives that I know you would not select. So while you have these vacancies where the Nevada Commission on Judicial Selection forces the governor to provide more options, they're not necessarily real alternatives. Now, the other part is maybe there's more than just the letter of the law, and there's the spirit of the law. Right? When we're talking about the spirit of the law, it might be that the executive, the governor says, okay, here are three people I like, you can pick among them. Right? Sometimes it's sort of easy comparison. I like all of these judges, they would all do fine. Right? And sometimes when you're filling a position as governor, what we have seen is some governors say, here are three people, they would all do a fine job. You can pick any of those people, right? When Neil Gorsuch became, when the Democrats in 2016 wanted to appoint a replacement for Justice Scalia, they had a list of people, and those are all acceptable people that could go into that office. All of them acceptable people go in that office, right? But it wasn't important which ones. When we get to other aspects, right, in the governorships of before Governor Sisolak, right, very clearly, I'm only going to pick one alternative, and I'm going to give you two really bad alternatives, and you're definitely not going to take those. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about, so the slides are done, I want to talk about is why court cases don't work the way that we expect them to. And we'll talk about this again when we talk about the judiciary system in the federal government. If you go to a court case, right, say you want to sue NVE, right? If you want to sue NVE, you have to be an NVE, Nevada Energy Company, right? You have to actually be a servicer, right? You have to pay NVE Energy to provide it to your home, right? So that first part is called standing, right? Standing is the very first part. And so you have to have standing in a case for it to be heard, right? Then there has to be a discrepancy. So you go and you try to go to your case, right? And say you don't get the outcome that you want, right? Sometimes we call this a test case when we talked about lobbyists before, or interest groups. You have a test case, so you need standing. The interest groups can't sue, this person can sue. Standing allows the plaintiff to go through the first rung of the court, the lower level, the justice, the municipal court. Then you go through an appeals process, right? The appeals process in the state of Nevada is it immediately goes to the Nevada Supreme Court if they pick it up, right? Or when they pick it up, because they have a backlog, and they say, is there a legal question here, right? In most other states and in the federal government, when you have an appeal, it goes to the next level and the district courts makes a decision. And the only time it would go to the Supreme Court is if two districts, the 9th district, and we're in the 9th district in the federal government, right? And sort of the 1st district, right? If they give different answers, right? If the two federal districts give different answers, that's the only reason why the Supreme Court would take up that issue. So you would have to have two district courts, right? Federal district courts give different answers on Roe v. Wade or pro-life or pro-choice. But the problem is they're already existing. Those cases exist, right? We talked about stare decisis, or we talked about precedent. So those districts aren't going to make different decisions. So first, you'd have to have standing. Then you'd have to have different decisions based on that. Then if there were different decisions, then the Supreme Court would take up that case. And it would be that specific case. That individual would have to be willing to go to the Supreme Court or as someone as their proxy in order to have that case heard, right? The court cannot take up questions without someone there withstanding. So when we talk about Roe v. Wade being overturned, that's impossible. Roe and Wade are dead, right? Long dead, right? Those people are gone, right? So when we have this issue, right, someone withstanding would have to come in with a pro-choice or pro-life issue and then make it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has a selection process in the federal government. And then that case could be heard. And if that case was a pro-life or pro-choice case, then that case could replace Roe v. Wade. But Roe v. Wade cannot be overturned. That's not how the Supreme Court works. So it's a little bit of an aside, right? But also right, a clear lack of clarity when we discuss these, right? When a journalist asks if they're going to overturn Roe v. Wade, that's not really, it's a question that's designed for the public, right? But it wouldn't matter if all 9 justices were very, very conservative, right? Which we don't know how conservative some of them are, right? Chief Justice Roberts, right, sort of much more moderate than expected, right? They still couldn't overturn a previous case because that's not how a court system works, right? You have to have an individual who's standing presenting a case. And then you decide that case, and the language of that case might change previous decisions, right? Precedent still matters, right? So I went off on a little bit there, but we had plenty of time. You should see an assignment for, you should see a new assignment come up that's going to be due Thursday. I want you to get involved. I have already gotten an email for someone who said they voted. Apparently, like some of the mail-ins didn't come with I voted stickers. So I don't need you to show me your vote. Because when you take a picture, take a picture. If you have an I voted, if you get an I voted sticker, take a picture, because that's very easy for me, because I don't have to like look for evidence. But if you got like a mail-in ballot or something and you take a picture, the one thing that I'd ask you not to is don't take a picture of how you voted. I don't want that information. Right? I don't want it because that's like, I've had students do a lot of things where they send me information I don't want. Right? I have students send me their credit card information, like their bank account information, right? Their social security number. Like I've had students send me a lot of stuff. Don't send me private information. Don't send me how you voted because I don't care how you voted. I just want you to vote. And when you do that, find a picture that you feel justifies it, right? And it is an honor system. But if you feel that extra credit isn't like worth voting, then we have a problem anyways. So I'm still going to give you the extra credit if you provide evidence and don't vote, right? I want to give you an honor system where I encourage you out of, and then if you send me something and you're like, I voted and then you didn't, because we have so much time, maybe the guilt will push you into voting, right? I want you to vote, right? So if you find some way to say, hey, look, I think this is evidence of voting, I'm going to accept pretty loose evidence, right? Just provide me with something and don't send me any more pictures of anything that you think you don't want out there, right? And that's also true, like a lot of people take selfies with it. Look behind you, right? I've had a lot of pictures sent to me that I had to either report or delete, right? A lot of pictures, right? That you're taking a picture in your room and your significant other is naked in that room. Just look behind you, right? It's happened like 6 times already. So just when you send me stuff, try not to give away evidence or do something inappropriate. All right, so that's it for today. Thank you very much. Make sure you go out and you vote and read your sample ballots, and right, all of that's coming up. And early voting is open, but it was like 45 minutes to an hour and a half early voting lines. So get out there and get your vote in. Day of voting is going to be a nightmare. So just get out there. Right now, you have the options, the maps, and the sample ballot. Have a good day.